Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. On November 5th, 2024, the US citizens will elect their next president. The election in US has raised considerable excitement among Indian audience as well, and hence IGPP has begun an educational series to introduce the audience to the various facets of the electoral procedure in the US and reflect upon the various issues that are important to the American voters, which in turn would acquaint the audience with the social and cultural complexities of the nation. The program would further reflect upon the consequences of the voters' choice upon the larger world with particular focus on India, and highlight the role played by the Indian and other diaspora communities in the US elections.
Women's role in the political landscape has evolved dramatically over the years. The struggle for women's voting rights in the United States is an important component of the larger movement for gender equality. The journey began in the 19th century, when women were largely excluded from the political process. The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 marked the official start of the women's suffrage movement, which was led by figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. These pioneers faced strong opposition, but their unwavering advocacy established the framework for the movement's eventual success. The passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 was a monumental victory, granting women the right to vote after decades of struggle. However, it's important to note that this victory was not universal. Many women of color, particularly black women, continued to face disenfranchisement due to racist practices like poll taxes and literacy tests. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a significant step in addressing these inequalities, although the fight for voting rights continues to this day, as seen in ongoing debate about voter ID laws and gerrymandering. The entry of women into Congress was another slow but significant process that reflected broader changes in American society. Janet Rankin, elected in 1916, was the first woman to serve in Congress, and her election marked the beginning of a gradual but steady increase in female participation in the legislative branch. Rankin's new perspectives and priorities for women's rights set a precedent for future female legislators who would bring new perspectives and priorities to the Hall of Congress. Election of Shirley Chisholm to Congress in 1968 as the first black woman to serve in the House of Representatives was another groundbreaking moment. Chisholm was not just a political trailblazer for black women, but also a staunch supporter of social justice, education, and equal rights. Her historic quest for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1972, though unsuccessful, set new precedents and inspired succeeding generations of women to seek the highest position in the states. Despite these breakthroughs, women remained vastly underrepresented in the Congress for much of the 20th century. It wasn't until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that the number of women in Congress began to grow significantly. The 1992 elections, often referred to as the Year of Women, saw a record number of women elected to both the House of Representatives and the Senate, marking a pivotal moment in the struggle for gender parity in American politics. Throughout American history and the struggle for equality, numerous women in various capacities have made indelible marks on the political landscape, breaking barriers and setting precedents. Eleanor Roosevelt redefined the role of the First Lady, using her position to champion human rights, social justice, and women's issues. Her activism on behalf of the disenfranchised and marginalized made her one of the most influential women in American history. Another notable individual was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, whose legal career and eventual selection to the Supreme Court changed the face of gender equality in the United States. Ginsburg's hard work as a champion for women's rights, notably in the legal arena, contributed to the removal of many of the institutional obstacles that had previously prevented women from reaching complete legal equality. Today, women continue to break barriers in politics. Nancy Pelosi's election as the first female Speaker of the House in 2007 was a historic achievement, and she has since become one of the most powerful and influential figures in American politics. The growing number of women in Congress has brought new issues to the forefront of the legislative agenda, including reproductive rights, healthcare, and gender-based violence, highlighting the critical importance of female representation in the nation's highest legislative body. Another woman whose career redefined not just the role of women in politics, but also the American political landscape has been Hillary Clinton. Clinton first entered the national political arena as First Lady during her husband Bill Clinton's presidency, where she took on a more active and policy-focused role than her predecessors, notably leading efforts to reform healthcare. Her subsequent election to the Senate in 2000 launched her career as a renowned Democratic political figure. Clinton's 2008 quest for the Democratic presidential nomination was historic, since she became the first woman to be a prominent presidential candidate. Despite losing the nomination to Barack Obama, she continued to serve in public office, eventually becoming Secretary of State in the Obama administration. Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign was another historic moment, as she became the first woman to secure the nomination of a major political party. Despite winning the popular vote, Clinton lost the Electoral College to Donald Trump, a defeat that shocked many and prompted widespread analysis. Clinton's loss highlighted the persistent challenges women face in achieving the highest offices in American politics, even as it also demonstrated the progress that has been made. Despite significant progress, women in US politics continue to face numerous challenges, many of which are deeply rooted in societal norms and structural inequalities. Gender bias and stereotypes remain pervasive, often manifesting in the way female politicians are covered by the media, treated by their peers, and perceived by the public. Women are often scrutinized more harshly than their male counterparts, with their appearance, demeanor, and personal lives frequently subject to unfair criticism. Moreover, women in politics often encounter significant barriers to entry, including fundraising challenges, limited access to political networks, and a lack of mentorship opportunities. These obstacles are even more pronounced for women of color, who must navigate the intersections of racism and sexism in a political landscape that has historically marginalized them. The culture of harassment and discrimination that exists in many political institutions also poses a significant challenge for women. The Me Too movement brought to light many of these issues, revealing the extent to which sexual harassment and abuse of power are prevalent in the political sphere. Despite these challenges, women continue to persevere, pushing for greater representation, equality, and justice in American politics. Kamala Harris's election as vice president in 2020 marked a historic moment in US politics. As the first woman, the first black woman, and the first person of South Asian descent to hold the office, Harris's election was a significant milestone in the ongoing struggle for gender and racial equality in American politics. Her career began as a prosecutor in California before she was elected as the state's Attorney General and later to the US Senate. Harris's heritage as the daughter of Jamaican and Indian immigrants has also played a significant role in shaping her political identity and priorities. Throughout her career, she has been a vocal advocate for immigrant rights, criminal justice reform, and social justice, issues that are deeply personal to her. Harris's election as vice president has been hailed as a major step forward for women and people of color in American politics, and her influence is likely to shape the future of the country. The history of women in US politics is one of struggle, progress, and resilience. From the fight for voting rights to the groundbreaking achievements of women like Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris, women have made significant strides in the political arena. However, the journey is far from over, and the challenges that remain underscore the need for continued advocacy, representation, and equality. As women continue to break barriers and push for change, their contributions will undoubtedly shape the future of American politics. As the US heads to the 2024 presidential elections, there's excitement and anticipation that the US might finally have its first female president. While the enthusiasm is palpable in some quarters, the criticism that has been directed at Kamala Harris from certain other quarters goes to show that the nature of politics, even in the 21st century, remains misogynist. To discuss the issue of gender in politics, today we are joined by Professor Michele L. Swers. Professor Michele is a faculty at the Department of Government in Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. She earned her PhD from Harvard University and has written 2 books on women and representation in Congress, namely The Difference Women Make, The Policy Impact of Women in Congress, and Women in the Club, Gender and Policy Making in the Senate. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talks, ma'am.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, our imagination of the US is, and it is to a large extent true, that it is a highly developed nation with high income, and from time to time we have seen strong female leaders on the American political landscape. Is the politics in the US quite inclusive of female, or are there barriers and glass ceilings for female politicians there as well?
So what's different about the United States from other, say, parliamentary democracies is you do not run as part of the party and move up in the party and get appointed by fellow partisans. We have very individual-oriented campaigns, what they call candidate-centered campaigns. So that means that you need to build your own organization and you need to show party leaders, particularly, that you can raise a lot of money. So our campaigns are very long and they're very expensive. And so you have to build your own network of people that you can count on for donations and then try to build your own network of voters. So that's something that's very difficult for a lot of people to do, but it's been difficult particularly for women because women have come to the political scene later. So men were the incumbents and men are the default when you think of politicians. And they are less likely to have wealth. So when we look at who donates in politics, more men than women donate to politicians, and maybe women are less likely to have these types of networks. So that system that we have that's very candidate-centered, where you're trying to build your own persona, if people have a view of what a politician looks like, and it's not a female or it's not a woman of color, right, then she has to work harder. So in the case of Kamala Harris, she always gets introduced in the media first as talking about her firsts, the first Black woman, the first South Asian woman, before you ever get to her expertise, to her policy, right? People are thinking of her as an unusual candidate. And she can try to spin that to her advantage, but it's something that a white male candidate has not had to face.
To go back a little in time, I just want to discuss how the history of the entry of women in politics, and has that progressed, the entry for female politician, has it always seen linear progressions, or did the judiciary or did the lawmaking bodies sometimes had to intervene through constitutional amendments to ensure that women had claim and access to decision-making bodies?
So the most important constitutional amendment for women in the United States really came around the time of World War I, and that was where women got the right to vote. And that was a very long campaign, and it was really pushed by the social movement of women's groups. So it was a very women-driven process, women participating in social movements, looking for suffrage. Many women got the right to vote originally by states. So you might get the right to vote in a school board, or you get the right to vote in a particular state. Wyoming, which is in the West, is our first state that gave women the right to vote. But we did not have a national right to vote until around the time of World War I. And part of the push for that was the idea that women were contributing to the war, and the United States was a democracy, and it doesn't look very democratic if you don't allow half your population to vote in national presidential elections. So our president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, was finally persuaded to support the amendment. So that's when women got the right to vote. We had some issues in southern states, of course. We had a period of time where Black voters were disenfranchised by local state governments in the South. So it's really the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where all men and women of various races and ethnicities are given the protected right to vote in the United States. So that's probably the most important for women getting involved in politics. But also women originally, a lot of the women in these social movements, they didn't want to be associated with one party. They wanted to be nonpartisan. And then over time, women started to associate more with the Democratic Party. So women's rights activists are associated with the Democratic Party. They started pushing the Democratic Party to appoint more women to political positions. So our first female vice presidential candidate came in the 1980s. And that was the Democratic nominee Walter Mondale chose Geraldine Ferraro as his vice presidential candidate. So that's the first nominee on a major ticket. And that was partially because women's rights activists pushed him to select a female running mate. Joe Biden, everyone knows, declared that he was going to choose a Black woman for the Supreme Court and a Black woman to be his running mate. And that, of course, was Kamala Harris. But generally, again, women have run very individually. And so they've pressured the parties sort of from the outside. So right now, the Democratic Party tends to be more associated as the party focused on women's rights. And the Republican Party tends to be more associated as the party that's a little more focused on traditional family values. But they've also had very strong female candidates in the past. And in fact, in this election, the only Republican that got close to challenging the nominee, Donald Trump, was a South Asian woman, Nikki Haley, who was the governor of South Carolina in the past and Donald Trump's ambassador to the United Nations.
I want to talk a little about the living experience, so as to say, of women in politics. And we have seen with Kamala Harris's candidature that although it has revitalized the Democratic Party's campaign and drawn a lot of money and enthusiasm, but a lot of criticism that she has received has not been about her policy stance, but about her love and about her mixed heritage. And are these simply the pitfalls of being a woman in politics in the US? Or is there also a tenor of racism to the criticism that she is receiving?
So for women running and for women of color running, I would describe it as a narrower lane. So again, people have in their mind sort of a particular vision of what a politician is. And so male politicians maybe can get away with a little bit more in their media coverage than a female politician can. So if you think of someone like in the United States, Senator Bernie Sanders, who ran and he was challenging Hillary Clinton for the nomination in 2016, and he also ran again for the nomination in 2020. He's known as somebody who speaks very loudly, who wears a disheveled suit and has disheveled hair, and that's part of his charm. That's part of what people like about him. But you could not have a female candidate that does that. A female candidate needs to be fully put together and will get more scrutiny over her appearance. So Hillary Clinton, they talked about her voice being shrill. Kamala Harris, maybe they're making fun of her laugh. Certainly the Trump campaign has brought that up. So women get a lot more scrutiny for how they look. They get more scrutiny for their family. So people will ask, if you have children, who's going to be taking care of the children? Right? They don't really ask that about a male candidate. So the Republican vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance, has young children. That doesn't come up as something where they'd be concerned about his leadership if he could take care of the children at home. So women will get more questioning about their background, about their appearance. And women in the past have felt more of a need to show their expertise, because people assume that a politician maybe is male and white. They feel they need to show expertise. So Hillary Clinton did this a lot, right? She had been a senator. Of course, her husband was the president, so she had experience as first lady. She was the Secretary of State. So she put a lot of emphasis on her expertise. So it's harder maybe for a woman to be the change candidate because they're very busy trying to prove that they have experience and they have expertise. So Kamala Harris is new in the way that she is sort of trying to show herself as the change candidate, the future forward-looking candidate, maybe in a way that a Hillary Clinton could not do.
I do want to focus a little on the contrast between Kamala Harris's candidature now and Hillary Clinton's candidature in 2016. And we saw that Hillary Clinton, despite the long-standing career in government she had, and despite her strength and the confidence that she had, she still lost the race to Donald Trump. And yet the Democratic Party has quickly moved and, sort of rallied behind Kamala Harris and placed their bet on a female leader, and that too a woman of color. So is there something about this election that is vastly different from 2016 contest? And if so, in what ways?
So some things are similar and some things are very different. So what's similar about American politics is the United States is very polarized right now between Republicans and Democrats. And the way that our presidential voting system works is we have a national vote, but what gets counted is something called electoral college votes. And electoral college votes are based on the size of the state. So each state gets a certain number of electoral college votes based on how much representation they have in our Congress. The House and then the two senators corresponds to how many electoral college votes you have. And we have, by voting this way by state, certain states have become swing states, and that group of states is smaller and smaller. So there are really only about 7 states that people think will decide the election. That was true in 2016, and that remains true in 2024. So based on that, they are trying to figure out sort of what is that voting combination that you can get. So that's what's kind of the same. And Hillary Clinton at the time in 2016, she won what's called our popular vote. So she won more votes nationally than Donald Trump, but she lost the electoral college vote. And the electoral college vote is what counts in winning the presidency. So In 2024, we expect it will be similarly close, that whoever wins is going to win by a very small margin. Some things that are different about 2024 is in 2024, we had a different Democratic candidate, right? President Joe Biden was running for re-election. He decided to step aside and endorse Kamala Harris. And so that creates a different dynamic, and that's kind of thrown the Trump campaign off. But also the issues are different. So since 2016 in the United States, Roe versus Wade, which is what guaranteed women reproductive rights in the United States, and if they wanted to choose having an abortion, that was overturned by our Supreme Court. And so now it's decided by the states. So that's become a major issue, a voting issue, in a way that it was not in 2016, and something that we see the Harris campaign really focusing on a lot. So that's a big change. We are, in a situation where the focus is on the economy and inflation and, different types of economic problems like that. Harris is focusing on trying to create a future forward message. And so she has a message that's also promoting issues like paid family leave and more support for childcare and things like that. So I think the issue environment is different than 2016. The fundamentals of how our electoral system and structure work and the polarization in the US political system is similar to 2016.
So I want to discuss this issue of abortion rights a little more, and we have at our show talked about Roe v. Wade and this issue many a times, and it seems that there's a very gendered angle to this election because the abortion rights are in the center stage, and Kamala Harris intends to make it one of the major plans of her electoral campaign. But the debate around the abortion rights seems a little regressive for even people like us. But I just want to understand what is at the heart of this debate. Is it just religious beliefs, or is there more than meets the eye? And also, is the whole genesis of the debate in the Roe v. Wade judgment, or there were other controversies around it, and how far does it go back in time?
So you can take this debate pretty far back in time, but in terms of Roe versus Wade was decided in the 1970s, and the decision became very controversial. So one fundamental question is this idea of women having a right to decide that they want to have an abortion, is that a fundamental right that should be a protected constitutional right? Or is that something that should be decided by the political system and the political culture in a state? And some states have more conservative political cultures than others, and some states have more support among their population for the idea of women being able to choose abortion than others. So Roe versus Wade was decided under a principle of the right to privacy that was drawn from several different amendments in the American Constitution. And a lot of lawyers, judicial historians have thought that the foundation of it was maybe a little bit shaky and maybe should have been, decided under other grounds, perhaps the 14th Amendment to equal protection or something like that. But when it was overturned by the Supreme Court in the Dobbs decision, that meant that now the states get to decide. And so what we see is that some states, and these tend to be the states that lean more liberal and more democratic, they want to protect the right to an abortion. And on the side of the groups that lobby in that way, some of them want to go further than Roe versus Wade, which was more focused on a trimester system, and give women even more autonomy and rights in this arena. On the other side, you have more conservative groups and more conservative politicians who really want to see this restricted. Some of them see this as similar to the abolition movement in slavery and give it that weight of importance. Some are very committed based on religious beliefs that abortion is wrong, and that women should be carrying children to term, and we should not have abortion. That gets pretty tricky because there's widespread support among the US population for some aspects like contraception, which gets some people who are opposed to abortion are upset about the idea of contraception as well, which is broadly popular in the US. There is an old law in the United States called the Comstock Act that's about not being able to mail lewd things through the US Post Office. And some people on the conservative side are talking about utilizing that to stop the sending of abortion pills through the mail. So that could create more of a national ban than you might think based on looking at things just state by state, because about 60% of abortions right now are done through the use of abortion pills. Another area that's gotten tricky is something called IVF, in vitro fertilization. These are fertility treatments, and these are also broadly popular among the American public, but those who are most committed to the pro-life views of abortion also maybe do not support in vitro fertilization. And so one of our states, Alabama, their Supreme Court had a decision ruling against in vitro fertilization. And then their state legislature had to come back and pass law saying that actually they do support the idea of in vitro fertilization, because embryos do get discarded in that process. And so some people are opposed to that. So I think more has come under the realm of scrutiny than people thought. I think in the past, when people thought about abortion, they were just thinking about the procedure of abortion and at what portion in the pregnancy it occurs, at how many weeks. And now it's expanded to include in vitro fertilization, contraception, and more issues. And that's why you see more initiatives on the ballot. So in the United States, states also have their own constitutions, and they can decide to put questions directly to the public to vote on. But you have to do that through petitions. So you have to get enough signatures, depending on the rules of the state, to get a petition on the ballot. And there are several states this year that also are considered important in the presidential election and the congressional elections that have ballot initiatives about abortion. And so people think that maybe that also might help Kamala Harris and some of the Democratic campaigns, because if they get people to turn out to vote in favor of securing abortion rights in a state's constitution, that they might also get those people to vote Democratic on the ticket for the congressional races in the presidency.
As a political scientist and as author of 2 books about women in politics in Congress, do you believe that having more female leaders does the society any good? We in India have reservation for women at local level governments, and we have studies that indicate that there have been tangible positive outcomes of that policy. If women in the US politics were like equally represented, what would it mean? How different would it make any difference to the society and the American political landscape?
So right now in the United States, we don't have a quota system. So there's nowhere where we're reserving seats, but we have seen women become the majority in some state legislatures. Women make up about 40% of the Democratic elected members of Congress. The Republican Party, they have fewer women. So the women in Congress and the Republican Party are more around 15% or so. But we can study what kind of legislation do women propose? What do they advocate for when they're in office? And in the research that I've done on Congress, the most important thing is always political party. So women aren't going to go against their political party, and women aren't going to go against their constituency. But where they have the space to choose what policies they want to focus on, we do see that women are more inclined to focus on policies that are going to have an impact on women, families, and children. So we have seen when there are more women in office, we do get promotion of policies related to paid family leave, increasing support for childcare. We can see this right now with Kamala Harris and her campaign. Her economic focus is very family oriented, and she is pushing for expanded attention to paid family leave and childcare as part of her platform. So we do see women emphasize issues like that and social welfare policy in general a little bit more. We also see more focus from women, particularly Democratic women, on these questions of reproductive rights. So when you look at in the Congress, who is most forceful in pressing for reproductive rights, it tends to be legislation being led by Democratic women. And you saw that even in the Biden administration, Kamala Harris was always the one taking the lead on reproductive rights. For Republicans, there was a period where there were more moderate Republican women that were elected, and they tended to be more socially liberal. These days, Republican women are equally conservative to Republican men, the ones that get elected. And you will often see the Republican women leading the charge on the other side, that they are more likely to press for more pro-life policies. But you also have seen in the current debate some of the Republican women offering compromise policies, or what they would consider compromise policies. So Senator Katie Britt from Alabama has led a policy to say that Republicans do support in vitro fertilization. You know, they just want to change the language, and they don't support as far as Democrats would go. So we do see women maybe advocating more for policy that's focused on women, children, and families than you would see when you don't have women with a seat at the table.
Our imagination of US may be a little different from what the US American society is actually like. And we sort of see it as a champion of gender rights, because some of the problems as that we have in India wouldn't be the problems that the American society has. And we see that it seems to us it's very open and technologically advanced society. And when you have technologies and when you have poured money into research for making people's lives easier, like through IVF or through abortion, and that is in many ways lessens the burden of women, then why is there even a debate around it? Like I mean, we are in the 21st century, right? So, and like, also, what do the women think about the whole debate? I mean, we see that obviously a lot of women have gone out in the streets, and when the Supreme Court verdict was announced, they protested against it. But then why are the politicians, if women at large believe that women should have abortion rights, then why are conservative leaders so bent on like banning not just abortion, but a lot of like the associated technologies?
So it's very complicated, the position of women in the United States. So women are not a monolithic voting bloc in the United States. And if you look at public opinion on abortion, public opinion has been relatively steady over time and fairly equally split between those who would describe themselves as pro-choice, meaning they support abortion rights, and those who describe themselves as pro-life. And there has not been a large gender gap on this issue when you just look at straight public opinion. But women are more likely to rate this issue as important to them. So to prioritize it compared to men. And so that's where you see the activism among women. So there are women that are very engaged in fighting for abortion rights, and you're seeing that. But there are also women that are very engaged in fighting against abortion. And there's a complicated opinion in the United States among Americans when it comes to the place of women in society. So when you look at questions of should women have equal rights, should women be, allowed to work, will a working mother have as strong a relationship with her preschool age child as non-working women? People are generally very supportive of the idea of women having rights, women in the workplace. But when you ask questions that are more focused on the child and more focused on motherhood, Americans also, many of them have very traditional values about gender roles and who should be responsible for taking care of the children and who should be responsible for the home. So both those things can exist in the same mind. And so it makes people ambivalent sometimes about what they want to see in gender roles. And generally, Democrats seem to support a more egalitarian position for women, and Republicans, maybe Republican voters, some of them have more traditional views about the role of women. And so we see that sort of conflict all the time throughout American politics.
My second question relates to the relation of race and gender, and not exactly like related to each other, but I follow a lot of American pop culture and news media, and I realize that the American society seems very sensitive to the issue of race, and they're very sensitive about things like saying certain terms, or maybe like there has been major controversies regarding like blackface or appropriating another racial culture and such, and careers have been cancelled over such things. But then there are also like influencers or like influential personalities who would on their podcast say that Kamala Harris slept her way through to the top, and really they have no consequences, and that is just so astounding to me. Like, I understand that you have the First Amendment and people are able to say a lot of things and just get away with it, but it just so like, if you, I mean, it's not very respectful, right? You don't say certain things, or but then you say such maligning things on national television or on social media platforms, and nothing.
Yeah, so it's pretty complicated. So race is the biggest divide in American politics. So if you look at voting in the United States compared to other countries, class might be a bigger divide in other countries. So they'll talk about, say, working class voters in the United States. But working class voters, there's not such a big division when you compare it to race, particularly when you compare it to African Americans. So African Americans will vote 80, 90% for the Democratic Party. It's the largest division that we have in American politics. All right, and we have a fraught history, from before the Civil War and slavery, and the civil rights movement and suppression of voting rights and all of these things. So it's a very sensitive subject in the United States. But what you're referring to, I think, when you say, well, on the one hand, people can say these really negative things, but on the other hand, you can also get canceled for that. These two things do coexist in American pop culture, as you say. It used to be that in the United States, there was one type of media, and that was broadcast television, and that was very heavily regulated. And even today, if you're going to watch some of the major broadcast channels, you're not going to see that type of discussion because it's very regulated and they try to reach a broad popular audience. Where you see it more is in cable television, which is very provocative, and you're trying to get clicks for advertising, for news, and in social media, which we now can exist in our own social media bubbles. So if you want to find that kind of a discussion, it's very easily found. And then the algorithm will keep feeding you that kind of discussion. And so it creates outrage. Outrage creates sharing and clicks, right? People don't share things that are just nice and boring and based on policy platforms. But if somebody says something provocative, that's going to get shared quite a lot. And I think that's what you're seeing. And Kamala Harris being, as we've talked about, a new kind of candidate and a first, she's going to get more of that kind of focus and attention.